I guess I was fairly apprehensive the whole time that I was flying in combat. And I guess there's good reason to feel that way. I'm there to cause a lot of damage and a lot of harm, and therefore they would like to damage me. And I was 25 years old at that time. Top Gun was really a thrill. I must have done well in actual combat because at the time I was just a lieutenant junior grade, which is a first lieutenant in the Air Force. And so I may have been the very first lieutenant junior grade to go through Top Gun. That was the dream of a lifetime come true. I had wanted to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot just like my dad from the time I was 10 years old. STS-27 was my third launch, and it was only the second launch after the Challenger accident. Well, I will never forget, we maneuvered the arm, and Mike Mullane was my arm operator, so he moved the arm over there, and we brought up the television image of the right wing, and I looked at what I was seeing, and I said to myself, we are gonna die. To be an airline pilot, there was mandatory age 60 retirement. I was a NASA astronaut until I was 50 years old. And so I looked at the situation, and I had known a number of Southwest airline pilots. And they were just like me. They were flying because they loved to fly. Well, there's a lot of piloting that goes into it, a tremendous amount of piloting that goes into it, because you're going to wind up passing other airplanes. You're going to get in a duel with another airplane that's fairly closely matched. So there's a ton of satisfaction from doing that. And hey, let's just talk about the racing itself. It's fun to fly low, but it's dangerous.
I'm Bill Harrison, one of the Warbird directors, and I add my welcome to those of you who have been here for a while, and many of you are like me, that you've, this is a a thing. Families come. It's from that standpoint, it's great. I'd like to ask one question. How many veterans are there here? All the veterans, stand up. I want to see you. Welcome. Thank you very much for your service. Today we've got a very interesting program. Those of you who were sitting here the last hour heard a lot about the Corsair, and we are indeed featuring the Corsair, but basically this is a people program, and we're very honored today. So first I'm going to introduce retired Lieutenant Commander Doug Matthews, who will introduce our speaker. Doug?
Thank you. And I know many of you thought that I was actually Captain Hudner, and I'm not. We'll be having him talk in a minute. Thanks for coming, and I thought I'd set the stage a little bit by introducing where we were at the beginning of World War II in naval aviation. In December 7th, 1941, primary Navy fighter, Navy and Marine Corps, was the F-4F Wildcat. And that had been designed in the early 1930s, and it was really our first major production aircraft after biplanes. So it was not what I would call a very advanced fighter. We had a decent kill ratio with the Japanese at the outset of the war, but not due to aircraft performance, but due to discipline and training of the American Navy and Marine fighter pilots. The kill ratio was decent, but we needed a large improvement. And the ministry, the War Department, put out a contract, and Grumman was awarded the Hellcat, the F-6F Hellcat contract at about the spring of 1942. And Chance Vaught was awarded the Corsair contract. And so here you have two competitors, and they're trying to produce, with no end in sight, of course, in 1942, trying to get airplanes out to the fleet, trying to build a lot of ships, and the build-up's going on. The average pilot coming in is maybe 20 years old, 21 years old for the Navy, has maybe, by the time he goes and sees his first fighter, maybe has 200 hours. So not a lot of flight time, certainly not a lot of mission training time, no instrument flying to speak of, a little bit under the hood, as they would call it. And so you have very young folks and then a very new design. So Grumman's over there building F-6F Hellcats to beat the band, and Corsair is being built by Chance Vaught initially. A little bit about the airplane. They built about 12,500 of them. The vast majority, almost 9,000, were built by Chance Vaught. So if it's a Chance Vaught airplane, the designator will be an F4U-, usually either a 1 or a 4. This is a 5. Goodyear was given a big contract to help manufacture these things in Akron, and if it was built by Goodyear and they built a couple thousand, Goodyear's designation was an FG-1D. A lot of people always come up to you when you have the airplane and they say, how many of them did they make? They made about 12,500. How many of them did they make where the wings didn't have to fold? They all folded. They were all foldable. They didn't always get folded if they were land-based for a while. So they all fold. Somebody else will come up and say, I thought it had a 3-bladed prop. Well, depending on the model, some had a 3-bladed. Later aircraft had the 4-bladed. So starting with the Dash 4s and onward, they had 4-bladed prop. They all had a Pratt 2800, R2800 engine, some version of it. I think as you approach the airplane for the first time like I did, I was amazed at the size of it. If you haven't been up close and personal with a Corsair before, you walk, as you get closer, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger compared to, say, a Mustang or a P-39 Air Cobra. It's a large aircraft. It weighs 2,000 pounds, empty weight, more than, say, a P-51. It's a complex aircraft. The aircraft is a hydraulic airplane. It has 8 hydraulic subsystems. And the next airplanes that were made after this era were jets. So the systems on this aircraft were sort of a precursor to the systems that you would find on a jet. And other than the canopy operation, which was changed on the Dash 5, the systems on the F9 Cougars and Panthers were pretty much the same as a Corsair. The wings do fold right here. And that's, of course, so they can have more deck space available on the carriers. In those days, they had just a single straight deck. And I think the first time I got around a carrier, I was always amazed because everybody would, say, God, how can you land that jet in 800 feet or 1,000 feet, depending on which carrier you're on? And I hated to tell them, but we really only land in about 200 feet. Just the rear 200. We take off in about 200 feet. So it's interesting. These prop airplanes, although they ended up with catapults, and there are catapult hooks on the aircraft, they did not require a catapult if you could get a good deck run. The airplane can develop 2,000 horsepower or more, depending on whether you can use water injection or not. The other thing that strikes you is, the gull wing. There weren't too many gull wing aircraft, and so everybody always asks, why did this aircraft have a gull wing? And as you can see, if we were to rotate this propeller down to the vertical position, there's really only about 12.5, 13 inches of clearance, even with the gull wing. So what they did is they, in order to get a huge prop on there, they have a bit of a dip in the wing, and that forces the gear to be farther down without having to have a very long gear strut. If you're familiar with the Grumman's F8F Bearcat, you'll notice that it has a very long, and there's one out there, very long gear strut. But the more landing gear you have to retract into the wings, the less ability you have to store things like fuel, which is dear to my heart, ammunition, rockets, bombs, things like that. So Chansfot said we're gonna have a great combination. We're gonna have a shorter gear, although when it lifts off, the gear drops another 8, 12, or 13 inches down on the strut. Comes up, and the gear comes up and rotates, kind of interesting, up into the well. And so the gull wing is to get the prop up off the deck, especially when you touch down. There might be a tendency in some pilots, not all pilots, of course, but some pilots might hit with authority, and the gear will compress, and we don't want to strike the prop on the deck, especially during World War II when we had wooden decks. The other surprising thing to me was that it was the first airplane I flew where there is no fuel in the wing. There's no fuel in this wing. And there were no fuel in any of the wings after the early birds, the Corsairs. So all the fuel is either in jettisonable drop tanks or from the engine compartment firewall back to the beginning of the windscreen. That's the fuel, 255 gallons. So you have 2 or 3 hours without a dogfight of fuel. And then if you put on drops, you've got 5, 6 hours without a fight. And so it's got tremendous loiter time. And so Lieutenant Junior grade Thomas J. Hudner Jr. is on his first cruise and is assigned number 4 in a 4-ship, which is going to have a 2-ship following. So we're going to launch 6 Corsairs, armed to the teeth, go in there and be available to work with the forward controllers, air or ground, and go after the bad guys. And he was number 4. Jesse Brown, the first African-American naval aviator. Navy was a little slower than the Army Air Corps. And Jesse Brown was number 3, so he was his section leader and deputy flight leader, and Jesse and he are going in. Now, for the boring part's over, I'd like Captain Hudner to maybe share a little bit of his experience. If you want to read in detail about his mission, and you should, you can see it on our website, classicfighters.org. And also he'll be available to sign autographs in the bookstore immediately following the talk. And you want to say anything, or
Me?
or either of you? I'm tired.
Well, I think we ought to let him talk. They didn't come to hear me talk.
Well, thanks very much, Doug. That's a very interesting presentation. I learned some things about the Corsair I hadn't known before.
Some of them are true.
This talk may be monitored, so. I finished up flight training in the summer of 1949, and I went through Pensacola and Corpus Christi. They had, the training program was broken down into several segments. They had multi-engine training in Corpus Christi, and then fighters also in Corpus Christi, but at a different place. The Navy had at that time, had a lot of excess airplanes, all World War II, of course. And one of the training squadrons was Corsairs. And I got chosen to fly the Corsairs as opposed to the F-6F Wildcats. And it was a great airplane to fly. We went right into that from flying the SNJs, or similar to the Air Force's T-6. We got about 100 hours of Corsair time before we got our wings, which followed getting six landings on an aircraft carrier which operated off Pensacola. I reported to a squadron in Quonset Point, Rhode Island, which is on Narragansett Bay, just across from Newport and Naval War College. And when I got there, the squadron had Bearcats, but they're getting rid of the Bearcats. As good an airplane as it was for a particular mission, it was hard to operate on the air carrier, but they had plenty of Corsairs. We deployed after I got aboard, deployed for the Mediterranean in the summer of 1950 with F-4U-4s. At about halfway through the deployment, the North Koreans invaded South Korea, and we were eventually sent around to Korea. We were in Beirut, Lebanon at the time we got the word we were going to go, so we went from Lebanon across the Mediterranean and back into Norfolk, Virginia, where we spent 10 days working on the ship and working on aircraft. Then from there down through the Panama Canal up to San Diego, then out to Hawaii, from Hawaii out to Japan, and then into the operating area off the east coast of Korea, north or south, depending upon where the action was. On the 4th of December, we were involved in full-time operations against the North Koreans who pushing the South Koreans and the Allied forces to the south, then without warning, except that the Chinese had threatened the United States that they'd enter the war if we got to be a threat to the Chinese. And that did happen just after Thanksgiving of 1950. Their numbers were such that the Allied troops are outnumbered about as much as, in some places, 10 to 1. So we were operating as much as we could all through the day with 3 aircraft carriers, sometimes 4, depending upon their availability. On Sunday, the 4th of December, as was described, Jesse and I were two of a member of flights up in the vicinity of the Chosin Reservoir. And the reservoir is in the mountains of North Korea. The mountains up there were about 3,500 feet above sea level. It was in the middle of, getting to be the middle of the winter. The temperatures on the ground were as low as 35 below zero at night. We did everything we could to help the troops on the ground. And it was an armed reconnaissance flight we had on this particular day, which incidentally was in the afternoon. Halfway through the flight, one of the flight called out to Jesse Brown that he apparently was losing fuel. And Jesse came up shortly after that and said that he was losing power and was going to probably have to crash someplace. Jesse did crash in a fairly open area. It was not the side of a mountain, but it was in the rough territory, under about 2 feet of snow. As soon as he crashed, we saw that the canopy, which was open, which is routine procedure doing takeoff and landing in those days of still prop planes. The canopy was open at the time he hit the ground, and it slammed shut as a result of the crash. The engine had broken away, and he had opened the canopy after he stopped and waved to us to let us know that he was alive, but for some reason didn't get out of the cockpit. And there was smoke coming out from under the cowling and gave us a great deal of concern that that smoke would develop into fire. So our flight leader had left us and called for a helicopter, and while he was off our radio frequency and was not in contact with us, the smoke for a short while got to be more intense than it had been, so I got quite concerned about that and decided that I'd make a wheels-up crash landing close to his airplane and just pull him out of the cockpit and wait for the helicopter, which we had been assured was on the way, but it'd be probably half an hour before we could get up there. And I was concerned that that smoke may have developed in the plane and caught Jesse before we could get him out of the cockpit. Well, I ended up about 100 yards away from his plane and got to his plane and had some difficulty climbing up on the wing to look into the cockpit because the snow made the bottom, the soles of my boots just like ice. In the meantime, when Jesse saw me coming, he very calmly said to me, "Tom, we've got to figure out a way to get out of here." Well, you can see how there's not a horizontal surface on this airplane. The wing comes down from the fuselage and about 6 feet out, it comes up again. So any movement I made had to be supported by grabbing something on the airplane, because I just couldn't do anything without a handhold of some sort. I was able to climb up in the fuselage and look into the cockpit and saw that the reason he didn't get out was because of the way the aircraft was buckled at the fuselage, at the cockpit. His leg was pinned in there and he couldn't move. He had taken his helmet off and he had taken his gloves off. Took his gloves off, I think, to help unbuckle his parachute. And took his helmet off for whatever reason. So I had a wool cap in my flight suit, and I pulled that down over his head and ears. And there was nothing I could do about the gloves except that I did have a scarf in my flight suit pocket. took that out and wrapped it around his hands, which were already beginning to get frozen in the shorter time that he was on the ground. I got the word that the helicopter was on the way, and in about 15 or 20 minutes, one did appear. And it took a while for him to land. When he reached us, he circled around for at least 5 minutes before deciding to land. And I was concerned that he was concerned about the wind. So I had a smoke bomb and a flare attached to my life jacket, which was the usual equipment we carried. And the helicopter landed, and I found out later on he was concerned about setting that airplane down because it had engine trouble, and he was afraid that if the engine quit or started sliding down the side of the mountain, we'd have been in tough shape. Well, the helicopter pilot and I worked together trying to free Jesse, and there's no way to do it. We just couldn't get the leverage to do anything significant. And in the meantime, trying to talk with Jesse, it was quite difficult. After a while, I think he was losing consciousness. He didn't respond to a lot of what I was saying. And I think he was under a lot of pressure. I think he was in a state of shock. And the helicopter told me that he had to leave because he couldn't fly after dark, and dusk was approaching. So we had to tell Jesse that we had to go get some equipment. We couldn't pull him out of the cockpit with what we had. And his last words were before we left was, if anything happens to him, to tell his wife, Daisy, how much he loved her. The helicopter took me down to a base camp the Marines had at the foot of the Chosin Reservoir. And he landed there to get instructions from superiors as to what to do from there. In the meantime, there were Marines who had been struggling across the now frozen Chosin Reservoir, who were absolutely exhausted. They'd been fighting for 3 or 4 days up to this time. They were desperate to get out of that hostile area and hoped to get a ride from us to safety, which was obviously impractical, and not only impractical, but impossible. So we went to another base camp about 10 miles away, and I spent the next 3 nights there with the Marines, with the Chinese communists and the North Korean troops, close enough so that we were concerned that if they had attacked us, we wouldn't have had radio communication. So I was waked up all through the night with them by one of the Marines starting the Jeep with a radio on it so that when we really needed it, it would have been reliable and we could use it. Well, to make a long story short, I was taken back out to the ship, and the captain, who had, because of communications, didn't really know what was happening ashore. And here it was 3 days later, December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. And the decision finally was to send some aircraft up and napalm Jesse's plane and mine. And when they found the wreckage of both our airplanes, Jesse was still in the cockpit. And he was given a warrior's funeral by dropping napalm on his airplane. I was taken back out to the ship. I was already on the ship, but that deployment went on for a couple more weeks, and then our ship was. We came from the Atlantic Fleet. We were only on loan to the Pacific Fleet from the Atlantic. And we were so short of carriers and other ships and the other services of resources they needed to fight a war But we came back home, leaving the area on the 20th of January, and then the rest is history. I got called several months later by the White House and was presented the Medal of Honor by President Truman. But it was a tough war. The war went on 2.5 years after that. You probably know how it ended up almost as a stalemate 3 years after it had started. But South Korea was not lost. South Korea, it turns out through all these years to be the most industrially advanced, one of the most industrially advanced countries in the world, and North Korea is an absolute basket case, again is a threat to us.
Why don't you join me in standing, not just for the talk, which was great, but to recognize a true American hero.
You stay there.
Thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Bill.
Have a seat. Go ahead and sit down.
I don't know that there are any words that can express our appreciation. They're just not adequate. And we do appreciate what you did and appreciate what each of you who's served. I remember as far as I was concerned, I was finishing high school when you were out saving the country. And I really do appreciate it. Yes, Doug?
They just announced they're naming a ship.
Yeah. They are. What is it?
Well, it's funny. I called him and I said, God, this is just great. They're naming a ship after Tom Hudner. And he said, yeah, it's not an aircraft carrier, though.
Well, maybe next time. Anyway, I hope that each of you has enjoyed the presentation. We were going to do some stuff on Wildcat. There's another thing going on as we speak. The Navy is recovering a Wildcat from Lake Michigan. Chuck Thornhill is here, and he's participating in it. And fortunately, the Navy has sort of changed its attitude and is now seeing the value in what is being done to preserve our heritage and our flying heritage. That's what the EA Warbirds of America is all about. Thank you all very much for coming today. Again, we thank Captain Hudner for his efforts and for his speech today. Thank you very much. And Doug, you did good too.